All right, now that we've assembled our strip piece sets, we're gonna take these sets and create these hourglass quilts. This quilt right here is made using these 2.5-inch pre-cut strips. I have another variation to show you. Here's a slightly smaller scale variation, made smaller because the width of the strips is smaller. These were cut 2-inch wide strips. And you can see how just that slight difference shrinks the size of the quilt block itself. This layout, as we play with the layout, you've got multiple options as well. Here I'm going to show you how to create this pinwheel effect using our strip set. And this quilt here, the blocks are more randomly placed. So you have multiple options. Both instructions for both quilts will be found in your class materials, including the fabric requirements and the cutting instructions, so that you can try both. You can try the techniques in both and take this technique and use it in other projects as well. All right, let's walk through the steps of creating this hourglass block. So here I have my strip set that we just pieced together, and I have my contrasting fabric. Here you can see the contrast. I use the same contrasting fabric throughout the quilt so that the strip sets really pop. In this one we use the solid white. And so that's another good example of, you could use something subtle with a subtle design, as in this quilt here, and that creates a more subtle contrast, a different look, or you can use a solid and really let those strips pop. All right, the width that we need to cut our contrasting fabric is the same as the width of the strip set. So the instructions for this width and all of this information will be in your class materials. We're going to walk through this quilt right now. So I have an 8.5-inch wide strip cut to go with my 8.5-inch wide pieced strip set. I'm going to place this contrasting fabric right sides together with my strip set. And I'm going to line up those edges, and we're going to sew along both sides of these matched up sets. So here's what it'll look like. Here I have another set ready to go, sewn together. You can see my seams, 1/4-inch seam allowance along both sides, and I've created this tube from these two pieces put right sides together. Now we're going to do all the fancy cutting to make these hourglass shaped blocks. The first thing I need to do is square off the end. And here's why matching up those ends isn't going to matter. We're just going to cut it right off. Make sure you've got a square 90-degree angle. I'm lining up my 8.5-inch line along the bottom, along the top edge. Hold it in place and just trim that edge off. Make sure you got all the selvage edges off, so I'm not dealing with those anymore. Now I'm going to rotate it. So I'm working with using the ruler as my measurement guide, not the cutting mat. So it doesn't even matter where this is on the mat, because this is going to be my guide. We're cutting squares, so keep in mind we have an 8.5-inch wide strip set and background fabric, so we're going to cut an 8.5-inch long square. And again, make sure those edges are square and straight. And we need to cut 4 of these from our strip set. And just stack them up neatly on top of each other, because we're not done cutting them yet. One more. I do have this, this little remnant piece left over that I could save and use for something else, but for now I'm just going to set it to the side. All right, so I have 4 identical squares that have come from this tube. Now we're going to cut these on the diagonal, and I'm going to just cut from corner to corner. Now here is an important tip. Let me show you what this is going to look like first. When I open these up, I get 2 sets of triangles lined up next to each other. And you can see they're slightly different. This one I have the yellow as the dominant largest strip, and here I have the pink. So I've got two totally different, well, almost totally different sets of triangles just from cutting through these layers of strips and this tube that we've sewn. So I'm going to set those to the side and cut all of them. Now here's the important thing that you need to keep in mind. When you go to cut your tubes, you need to make sure, this is really critical, you need to make sure that your seams stay at the top and the bottom of your set. If I were to turn it this way and my seams are running on the sides and I cut that same diagonal, I'm going to get a different different shaped triangles, and they're not going to match up. Here's my boo-boo. And you can see, so here is where I cut with my diagonal with the seams on the sides, and when I open them up, here's the problem. If I were to go and sew these together, they're not going to contrast. We want these to alternate strips and background, strips and background. So here's my boo-boos. Don't do that. I brought them to make sure you could see what happened if you did it. Here's a way to make sure you're keeping things straight. I just keep my ones that I've cut right in front of me, so I can always look and say, yep, I need to keep it identical to this. We want to do all of them exactly the same. So always keep your seams at the top and the bottom. Otherwise, you'll end up with pieces that you can't use in your quilt. And we'll just go ahead and cut all 4 sets. Corner to corner. This again is where this giant square ruler also comes in really handy. And we're going to use it again in a minute as we square up the blocks we're going to assemble. All right, so now I have 4 of one set and 4 of the opposite. And always you just, these last little, as you open up this, you'll pop these last little stitches easily and open up those blocks. Okay, now we're going to give these a quick press, and we're going to press our seam allowance toward the piece strips. And this again is an important step because it will make a difference in how we assemble not only this pinwheel block, but the whole quilt. So just do a quick set the seams and press those open. And I can even just line up my stack and they're ready to do all together. Okay, from here, we're going to match up, I'm gonna put this out of my way, match up my sets and sew them right sides together. You want those seam allowances to just butt up right next to each other. That way those triangle points will meet and look really sharp. That might be a good place if you prefer to pin, to stick a pin in and just hold that as you're gonna chain these right through the machine together, one after the other. Because that's the one part that is gonna show. These edges are gonna get squared off or hidden in the seams, but that point where those seams intersect, we want that to look nice and sharp. Okay, now I'm going to bring these over to my machine. One thing to keep in mind is we're working with bias edges now. Because we've cut those fabrics on the diagonal, this fabric can kind of stretch, especially here. So we want to be really careful with that as you put, again, you don't want to pull it as you sew it through your machine. I'm going to let the machine just pull it. Let the machine do all the work, And you just gently keep that lined up with your 1/4 inch guide. And I like to hold my finger right there and make sure those seam allowances are butt up right next to each other but not overlapping. And again, kind of carefully ease this part through where we're sewing across those previous seams. And I'm going to repeat that process 3 more times. Now that those are sewn, separate them so that we can press them again. And this time, I'm going to show you a neat little trick for pressing these. Because they're sewn, this is these 4 seams intersect. It's like a 4-patch block. And so I'm just going to pop that seam open right there. And that way I can press in this kind of counterclockwise direction. If you can see the seams, this will make just a little tiny 4-patch right there. This again will help as we go to assemble the block, the pinwheel block on the quilt, and as we assemble multiple blocks together. So I do it from the back just to get my seams in the right direction, and then I press again from the front. That kind of caught funny. I might have to fix that. Let's do another one. So set that seam and pop that little, like you just are popping a stitch right there basically. And again, I get that counterclockwise direction for my 4 seam allowances and press from the front to really open it up. Get it nice and flat. There's one more. Oops. This also helps eliminate some of the bulk where these seams are can lie flat too. We have one more. This quilt comes together so quickly because these blocks are so big. We need to make 4 sets. I'm sorry, we need to make 9 sets of 4 blocks. So here's our first set of 4. And you'll see how quickly this set comes together. And then the quilt comes together because this block is so big. So it makes the quilt come together really quickly. Plus you've saved all that time because you've sewn the strips together instead of cutting all of these individual shaped pieces. Okay. Now, this is an important step, and it's not everyone's favorite, but it makes a big difference in how this block and the quilt comes together. We're going to square up these blocks now, and I'll show you with this one what we're going to do. Because, again, we're working with bias edges and stretchy edges, it's really easy for these blocks to get kind of misshapen and a little bit wonky. And so we want them nice and square. Otherwise, if we're sewing misshapen blocks together, our rows get out of whack and the quilt gets out of whack. So it's an extra step, but it makes a big difference in how your finished quilt looks. We need to square up these blocks to 10.5 by 10.5 inches. And rather than just starting with one side, we'd lose the center point. Our center point would be off center. So we need to find the center point and use that as our guide. So think about what is half of 10.5? That is 5 1/4. So I'm going to find the 5 1/4 inch mark in from both directions. And here's this dot right here. Get a pin that can kind of right there. You could put a piece of tape there, just anything to help you find it quickly, to use that as your guide. This ruler is also really handy because, let me put it here so you can see a little better. It has this diagonal line marked on it, and we're going to use that as a guide to keep our diagonal lines a perfect 45 degrees, so they're not getting misshapen either. So I'm going to come down my 45-degree line to that 5 1/4 inch dot. And I'm going to put that dot right on the center point of my hourglass. And then I can use this diagonal line to line up on this seam right here. That's going to keep my, my 45-degree line square, and it's going to help me square off these edges. And I can take that and do the first 2 sides. Now, this is where the rotary mat, the rotating mat comes in handy. I can just swing it around. And this time I can use, because I've squared off these 2 edges already, that's going to be my 10.5-inch square. So I can use the 10.5-inch lines, line them up on the edges, and that should mean my 5.25-inch dot should be right in the center, and there it is. I can just do those other 2 sides and get rid of that waste. And now we have a nice, perfect 10.5 by 10.5-inch square that has got square sides and our perfect 45-degree lines. I'll go ahead and just square up these other ones, and then I'll show you how we're going to assemble those blocks together. All right, and there we have our 4th block. Set those things aside, and now we can lay out this block, and I'll show you how the pinwheel works out. One thing to consider as you're piecing your strip sets is to use a dominant fabric. See how this dark pink has a lot of contrast with this background fabric. That will make this pinwheel really pop, and you can see that here. So we just placed our blocks in this rotating manner to create this central pinwheel. So as you're assembling your strip sets, put a dominant fabric on the outside of, or the top of your strip set, and that will create this effect like that. Now we're going to sew this together like it's a 4-patch block, a giant 4-patch block. And you can see here's where the pressing makes a difference. As I put these 2 right sides together, my seams are going to do the same. They're going to butt up against each other. They're going to be going opposite directions. It should be the same here too. You can see that. So I'm going to bring these over to my machine and just carefully feed these through. Again, this is, oops, I have a little, this is where we're working with that bias edge along these edges. It's going to stretch. It's because of that bias cut, that diagonal cut. So again, we don't want to pull our blocks through the machine. Just let the machine do its job and feed those through, keeping the 1/4-inch seam allowance. And now I have the second set, and I can even just kind of chain this one after the other. Just guide and don't pull. And you can see here where those should be meeting and butting up against each other. And then I can take this to my pressing board, and I'm going to press the seams in opposite directions. So I'm pressing away from the strip piece part. I'm going to separate them. Come over and set the seam and open it up and press the seam this direction. Repeat, do the same with the bottom half. And press that seam toward this background fabric. Then when I go to match up those sets of 2 blocks, again, my seam allowance is going to butt up against each other, creating that nice center point. And our seam allowances here on these corners will also be opposites. You can see it maybe a little better on this one. That helps those seams. This block does, because you've got a lot of strips, a lot of shapes, it does have a lot of seams in it. So we want to minimize the bulk as much as we can. So following these pressing directions should help a lot with that. It will help the seams be opposing and not on top of each other. And that will help your quilt block lie nice and flat. Let's get this last one through. And then once again, I can do the same thing I did earlier. It's a little trickier because there's so much more bulk. But once again, I can press my seams. This time we're going in a clockwise, but just always think this time we're always pressing away from the strips. We're pressing toward the background fabrics. And this has a lot of bulk, but you can kind of help flatten it out a little with the iron. So here, my seams press in this nice direction where they all, this will make it so that when you sew all of your blocks together, you're going to repeat this process to make 8 more blocks. So you'll have a set of 9 blocks, and you'll lay out your blocks 3 across by 3 down to create this fun square quilt. And as you go to sew those blocks together, all those seams should nest really nicely because of the way you've pressed. And here we have our pinwheel block in this hourglass shape. So an option, a fun way to use those strip sets and cut them and repiece them back in a totally different design, but a great shortcut for making an intricate quilt come together really quickly.